Thank you, and I'd like to welcome everybody to the 2021 version of the Communications Academy. Uh, this is rather unique since we're still in the global pandemic. The fact that we have to do this virtually rather than live, it's unique in the fact that it's different from past communication academies that were held live in the Seattle area. But this does give us the opportunity to expand globally. And as I understand it, we have participants today not only from the United States, but also from around the world. And I'd like to welcome everyone to the Communications Academy. And I hope you have an enjoyable experience and have good takeaways from this academy. As mentioned, I'm Brian Daly. My call sign is Whiskey Bravo 7 Oscar Mike Lima. I've been licensed amateur radio operator since 1977 when my high school physics teacher got me involved in amateur radio. I'm currently a technical specialist for the ARRL Georgia section, as well as a member of the Forsyth County, Georgia ARES team. In the past, those in Western Washington know me as a member of the Western Washington Medical Services team, as well as Seattle ACS. So today I'd like to talk about pandemics and power outages, what next? And to set the stage for this, we have to consider what happened in 2021. So 2020 into 2021 is a year that we are going to remember, or we'd rather forget. We've had COVID-19, obviously, that has changed society tremendously over the past year. But on top of that, we've had a number of other disasters that have occurred in 2020 to 2021. Hurricanes, we've had 30 named storms, the most on record in the U.S. continental hurricane landfall in a single season. We actually ran out of hurricane names, the official alphabetical list, and we had to move to the supplementary list of Greek letter names. Wildfires, we've burned more than 4 million acres across California, but it wasn't restricted to California. Other states such as Oregon and Washington were also impacted. We've had tornadoes. In January of 2020 alone, 50 tornadoes were confirmed across many states in the southeast. There were 1,022 total tornadoes in 2020, which unfortunately led to 78 fatalities. Rain and flooding, we've had dam failures in Michigan that forced residents to evacuate and on the order of 10,000 residents. We've had extreme heat. Phoenix, which is not unfamiliar to high temperature days, actually broke records with 144 days of 100 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, which again, even for Phoenix is unprecedented. And then finally, the winter storms. Into 2021, we've had Winter Storm Uri, which had widespread impacts both across the United States as well as northern Mexico and parts of Canada. Plus, we've had record-breaking blizzards in the Rocky Mountains and a significant snowstorm in the upper Midwest. But that was only what Mother Nature dealt. On top of that, we also saw domestic terrorism. Domestic terrorism reached one of its higher numbers ever in 2020, with more than 120 suspects charged by the U.S. government. And it's expected that this could rise over this coming year because of all the political polarization, persistence of the COVID-19 pandemic, worsening economic conditions, immigration concerns, racial injustice, and other factors. And one of the most notable domestic terrorism incidents was the Christmas Day Nashville bombing, and I'll talk more a little bit about that in a moment. There's also cyber threats. Tillamook County in Oregon, they penetrated the county's computer and phone systems through encryption malware. The coronavirus pandemic has spawned a huge increase in cyber threats and attacks, and a growing number of known threat groups have been specifically targeting electric utilities in North America, according to reports. And we can't forget about nation state threats. North Korea, Iran, China, Russia. We could expect more nation state cyber attacks as we move into 2021. So let's understand first some of the communication trends and what it means to communication emergencies. The ITU Secretary General, Hulin Zhao, said that the COVID-19 crisis shows how vital information and communication technology networks and services are, both in response to the current pandemic as well as to address disaster management. The COVID-19 has put focus on the communication needs. When we look at life's necessities, you think of food, shelter, clothing, sleep. But I think that we can add now a fifth necessity, and that's broadband access. If we look at data use on an average day, uh, we're seeing from AT&T, for example, 468.1 petabytes of data across the network on an average day. That's a 40% increase year over year. And we're also seeing a 51% increase in peak text data rates. That data use is the equivalent to streaming nearly 100 million 2-hour long movies in high def every day. And we expect customers are going to be using more and more data as we move forward. The predictions are in 2025, we'll see 4.6 terabytes per month, or roughly 5 times more data than we do see today. And today we see an average of 13 connected devices in the average home. We anticipate that that will grow to 32 devices in the coming years. There's a soaring demand for virtual connections as physical connections had to be put on hold. This academy is one example of that. We can't meet in person, so we have to meet virtually. Well, businesses are doing the same thing, as well as personal communications. We're seeing video conferences, virtual learning, business transformation, virtual doctor visits via telemedicine, and calls for aid from first responders, all becoming virtual. And what does that mean? It puts an increased demand on the communication needs. Even in an era of text messaging, Facebook, and FaceTime, we are seeing some return to ham radio for a sense of connection in a time of social distancing and isolation. Yeah, there's other ways to communicate, but ham radio is one of the ways that one can communicate and keep in touch with those that have a like mind and interest within your hobby. The commercial wireless networks are evolving too. You've probably heard a lot of commercials about 5G and the evolution from LTE to 5G. When we look at that, what exactly does it mean? Well, the chart on the right shows the three legs of 5G. First is enhanced mobile broadband. This is getting peak data rates up to 20 gigabits per second and the user experience data rates of 100 megabits per second. There's massive machine type communication. So instead of having a small number of connected devices, we're seeing potentially 1 million connected devices on the network within a square kilometer. And finally, ultra reliable and low latency communications. This is the ability to have latency in the millisecond range and also being very reliable so we can support public safety and other mission critical use cases. You've probably heard a lot about autonomous vehicles. Autonomous vehicles would require ultra reliable, low latency communications in order to operate, as well as enhanced mobile broadband in order to support the data needs that are required for those autonomous vehicles. So this is just a snapshot of what's coming in the future and actually are here now as 5G networks are being deployed, and it will evolve throughout this next decade. We're also seeing our served agencies evolving toward mobile broadband. Today, many of the served agencies use push-to-talk land mobile radios. However, the migration is toward mobile broadband. and you've probably heard of FirstNet. And this is a network to provide high-speed nation wireless broadband for public safety, and it's a dedicated network for public safety. It covers more than 99% of the population, supporting more than 15,000 agencies and organizations with about 2 million connections nationwide. It has a dedicated spectrum in the 700 megahertz range known as Band 14 that's set aside specifically for public safety mobile broadband. And it also supports mission critical services, push to talk, compact radio, rapid deployables, and what's known as Z axis location. So that gives you location in 3 dimensions, including altitude. FirstNet device and the app ecosystem has more than 210 FirstNet ready devices and 160 highly secure apps available for first responders. The reason why this is important is to understand that first responders are moving towards these commercial networks supporting mobile broadband, and this evolution is occurring quickly, and it's occurring through many agencies throughout the country. So what's the bottom line? The bottom line is society is highly dependent on commercial mobile and fixed networks. Social media is just one example of that dependency. And we're also seeing our served agencies continue to be dependent on communications. Yeah, we still have the traditional push-to-talk land mobile radio systems, but we are seeing that evolution toward the use of commercial mobile systems. And of course, the served agencies are also using social media for crowdsourcing and communication of information to the general public. The key is communication skills are the key. Yes, we have human-to-human communication, but that's rapidly expanding to human-to-machine or machine-to-machine communications as well. Let's dive deeper into some of the communication emergencies that we saw over the past year. First is wildfires, as mentioned earlier. 2020 was a record-setting year with both the number of fires burned as well as the number of acres burned in California alone. Wildfires do impact communication facilities. First off, the fire itself can damage the infrastructure. Second off is the power, loss of power due to the power lines being damaged or by the electrical grid shutdowns, for example, by PG&E that happened in California during the fire season. I highlight power in red because we're going to come back to that because you're going to see power as a common theme in many of these incidents. As a result of that, FEMA did make available 2 channels in 60 meters for interoperability between U.S. government and amateur radio involved in communications related to the wildfires. And the FCC did also grant an ARRL request for a temporary waiver to permit higher data rate transmissions than the current rates that are permitted under the FCC amateur rules. And this waiver allowed amateur radio licensees directly involved with the hurricane and wildfire relief to use HF Pactor 4 modems. The next incident was Nashville, and this happened on Christmas Day of 2020. What were the impacts? The facility that was included had communication points for regional internet services as well as local wireless internet and video. The service remained intact locally, but was on battery power. And unfortunately, a combination of the explosion as well as the resulting water and fire damage as a result, it took out a number of the backup power generators that were provided power to the batteries. And what happens once the batteries ran down, that led to service disruptions, not only in Tennessee, but also regionally across Kentucky and Alabama as well. And there was a prioritized restoration of wireless service that needed to be done. If we look at the timeline, it took many days before things were brought back to normal. Again, December 25th, which was when the incident occurred. Regional resources and national disaster recovery teams were brought in to assess and begin the restoration process. On the December 26th, the following day, the restoration continued with the focus of getting power to the equipment, and that meant connecting generators through the walls, deploying portable cell sites to aid in communication, as well as bringing in restoration assets throughout the region. On the following day, on December 27th, more than 75% of the mobility sites, the cell sites, were restored, and additional improvements as more equipment came back online. The service in Birmingham and Huntsville, Alabama, was brought back to normal. Remember, this is 2 days later. 96% of the wireless network was restored, and 60% of the businesses restored, and 86% of the consumer broadband and entertainment services were restored. On December 28th, the majority of services were restored, and 11 portable cell sites were still running in the region. And on December 29th, plans to bring commercial power back were delayed because of additional damage. So as you can see, power, again, is an essential element to restoring both the wireless and wireline communication. What were the impacts? They were very significant. 911 call centers were impacted, hospitals, the Nashville airport, government offices, as well as individual mobile users. And as a Vanderbilt University professor of computer sciences said, people probably don't realize that the 911 service was somehow associated with the telecommunications equipment and the connections that ran through that building. The residents in the area did receive reverse emergency calls to inform them not to dial 111, but instead to use another phone number. The hospital's landline phone systems went down. They were unable to receive incoming calls. Flights were grounded at Nashville Airport due to telecommunication issues. And of course, businesses had issues with credit card devices. And again, this was a multi-state regional disruption from Georgia to Kentucky, and communities across the Southeast also experienced FirstNet outages as a result of the bombing. And in fact, in Alabama, first responders had to use their two-way radio and text messaging system since the FirstNet system was disrupted. As the senator from Tennessee mentioned, the bombing illustrates the continued danger posed by bad actors to disrupt telecommunications networks critical to the American economy. Amateur radio was used as part of the Nashville response. The Williamson County ARRL team held continuous nets on their 5 repeater link systems to assist as needed. News updates from AT&T and county governments and assisting callers on AT&T to implement wireless calling on their phone was relayed, and nets were available for taking traffic and routing it to the state nets. The Middle Tennessee Emergency Amateur Repeater System also held nets on their DMR repeater system several times a day. Their main repeater at the Tennessee Emergency Management Agency was affected by the outage, but 2 repeaters in Williamson County had all communications going through them. So the question, how exactly would HAMS be able to fill in for a multi-state outage of internet, cell phone, and POTS line connectivity? That's the big question that, is a takeaway from the Nashville bombing. The next event I'd like to talk a little bit about are the winter storms and the Texas power crisis. This was the major winter and ice storm that had widespread impacts across the United States, northern Mexico, and parts of Canada from February 13th to the 17th of this year. Over 170 million Americans were placed under winter weather alerts during this time frame. And it did cause blackouts for over 9.9 million people, both here in the U.S. as well as in Mexico. The power crisis was a result of 3 storms that came through Texas, starting on February 10th and ending on the 20th. It resulted in massive electricity generation failure in Texas, and as a result of that, shortages of water, food, and heat. Um, the Texas interconnect is maintained as a separate grid, as shown in the figure. And this interconnect, as it went down, roughly 30 gigawatts of generating capacity was forced offline. So it was a major impact, and the fact that it was a separate grid meant that there was limited access to surrounding electricity generating facilities that could bring power into the state. So, what was the impact? Again, power outages across the state meant residents were without heat for days on end. When power started to come back on, a new shortage had emerged, and that's drinkable water. There were frozen pipes that burst across the state. Water that came out of the taps was undrinkable because of the dangerously low water pressure levels. And it was estimated that 13 million people were under a boil water order, which was nearly half of the population of the state of Texas. All of the major communications companies and services experienced major outages. The chart on the right shows the FCC reports. You can see in Texas alone, 279,585 wireless users were affected with 140 outages. There were 9,354 wireline users affected and 33,331 VoIP users. So there were quite a number of impacts to the telecommunications network as a result of the power crisis. And again, amateur radio was there in response to the Texas winter storm. We had ARRL and Red Cross volunteers joined forces in Texas to provide WinLink reports of infrastructure problems and unmet needs. There was support for the EOCs in many counties within Texas. The Williamson County ARRL team was activated by the Williamson County Emergency Manager to address power outages, vehicle accidents, health and welfare, and weather updates 24 hours a day. And those reports were delivered to Williamson County served agencies and emergency management. There were also warming shelters set up throughout the state, and ARRL teams were activated to support and staff those warming shelters, as well as several off-road groups that provided transportation for first responders, frontline medical, and others. So what's the common theme out of these disasters we've seen in 2020? Well, power, power, power. Communication systems run off power. They are dependent upon the commercial power grid. They may have short-term battery backup, but restoration involves bringing in generators with the eventual return to commercial power. Consumer devices also need power, whether it's your cell phone, computer, cable modem, or Wi-Fi router. It all requires power. And power is something that's impacted through many of the natural disasters that we see, whether it be wildfires, hurricanes, blizzards, earthquakes, or tornadoes. So what defines a communication emergency? Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about communications emergency and especially in the evolving communications ecosystem. We can define a communication emergency as a partial or complete disruption, congestion, or loss of a critical communication system. And remember, not every incident, disaster, or event is going to result in a communication emergency. COVID-19 was not in itself a communications emergency, but COVID-19 did impact communications. It increased the need for broadband communications as we shifted to virtual environment. The Nashville incident, as we talked about, resulted in both 911 as well as phone outages. That did result in a communication emergency. What's the amateur radio response? It's going to depend on several factors. First, what is the scope and impact of the communication emergency? Is it local or widespread? Is it short or long duration? What communication systems are impacted? And what's the time frame for restoration? Ultimately, the served agency need for amateur radio support is going to drive the amateur response, which means that the relationships with your served agency are critical, as well as training to respond. We can look at the anatomy of a communication emergency as shown on this chart. Starting on the left-hand side, we see normal communications pre-event. At some point, we enter the event phase where whatever the event happens to be is going to begin the communications degradation phase. That degradation phase is going to be dependent upon the event and will be variable. And once the communication degradation phase brings the communication or impacts the communication to a level where those systems are no longer operational, that's where the communication emergency begins, and that's where the opportunity for the amateur radio response begins. At some point, the communications restoration phase will begin. And again, the length of time to get that restoration back to the normal communications post restoration is very dependent upon the resources that are available to restore communications, as well as how much impact the communications infrastructure had. But at some point, you'll return back to the communications, normal communications post restoration. The variables, again, are going to be the event phase duration. Is it a short event that's going to impact very quickly, such as an earthquake, or is it a longer term event, such as a winter storm in Texas or a hurricane? The degradation phase duration, again, is going to depend on the event. Is your communication system going to be shut down completely almost immediately, or is it going to take some time and it slowly and gradually decays? The restoration phase, again, as I mentioned, is going to depend upon the resources available in order to restore the communications, and then that will all impact the length of the amateur radio opportunity. How can amateur radio fill the gap? Well, we first have to understand what are the communication system's dependencies. Are we looking at the mobile network with voice and data and social media? Is the landline network with voice and internet impacted? What are our served agencies' impacts to their radio system or the use of commercial systems? And don't forget the critical infrastructure. Is their power impacted? We need to understand the events and the event duration for your area. As I mentioned, short duration events such as an earthquake versus long duration events such as a hurricane will impact that response timeline. The short duration events can result in long duration communication emergencies, as you can imagine. If you have an earthquake with damage to the infrastructure, it may take some time in order to bring that infrastructure back online. Also, what critical infrastructure is impacted? Is the power grid impacted? Is the cell service impacted? Is the water impacted? And don't forget, don't plan for every possible low probability of occurrence event, but consider the history of events in your area. This wasn't the first time that Texas had a winter event. It's happened in the past. It's not frequent. It doesn't happen that often. But when it happens, as you can see, it could have a tremendous impact. So look back in history of the events in your area and try to understand what those events are and what the impacts would be to today's communication networks. How will these events affect the degradation phase? What systems are going to be impacted? How fast will they degrade? If we look at the cell networks, for example, if we lose power, we can expect the cell sites to last roughly on the order of 6 hours or less. So plan on a 6-hour time frame when those types of systems will degrade. How long will it take to enter the restoration phase? What's the extent of damage and the available resources to restore the infrastructure? And how long will the restoration phase take? What systems are going to come online first? Does the amateur response need to change during the restoration phase? And finally, develop your plan, work with your served agency, train to your plan, and modify your plan with any lessons learned. There's one thing we should all have in the back of our mind, and that's EMP. I call this the really bad day. It has the potential to disrupt unprotected critical infrastructure and could impact millions over large parts of the country. And yes, power again is the one of the impacts for this, as well as the cascading impacts as a result of power failures. When we think of EMP, you may think of a man-made nuclear explosion. Well, that's just one of the use cases for this. You could also have cyber attacks. And again, there's nation states that would love to get into our infrastructure and create massive failures in that infrastructure. There are also natural causes, such as a solar storm. HF will be the key for communications. The DHS shares program, for example, is one of the things that they're training for, and amateur radio should be aware of and trained for as well. Some lessons learned. Assume you're going to be on your own. We saw this in Texas, where citizens of Texas had to shelter in place, had no heat, had no water. They had to be creative in ways that they could provide the shelter and water for themselves. Uh, don't have a dependency on the grid, water supply, or grocery stores. Again, depending upon the event or incident, many of those services are not going to be available. And remember, by the time the disaster hits, it's too late to prepare. Be ready for cascading failures. Develop your operational plans, develop relationships, and train to the plan. And remember, communication goes beyond but involves amateur radio. One of the dependencies that the local agencies have are using the citizens as a sensor, as it's called, or crowdsourcing to gain better situational awareness. The whole community information sharing practices using social media and other non-traditional sources of information can support traditional information sources and act as an indicator of what's going on the ground. So be creative. How can amateur radio assist in crowdsourcing? Well, we already do today. For example, the National Weather Service Skywarn program, that's a form of crowdsourcing where we provide ground truth information to the National Weather Service during severe weather events. Just last night, here in the state of Georgia, there was a long track tornado that started in Alabama and traveled to the south of Atlanta. It unfortunately hit the city of Newnan, Georgia. And on the news, one of the first things they said was amateur radio reports coming from Newnan reported on the damage, extensive damage to that city. So amateur radio crowdsourcing, through the Skywarn program. The other example is the recent U.S. Geological Service and amateur radio earthquake reporting, Did You Feel It system. So in Southern California, the USGS is using amateur radio operators to help fill in the holes on where they can't get reports. So this type of crowdsourcing and how amateur radio can assist in crowdsourcing is important, especially using the citizens as a sensor method for gaining information and act as an indicator on what happens within the community. The second is, how can crowdsourcing help the amateur radio response? By understanding what's going on within your community, you can tailor the amateur radio response to the events within the community. For example, if there's a shelter being set up in an area that needs communications, through crowdsourcing, you can understand where those are and provide the amateur radio resources appropriately. So fortunately, we're saying goodbye to 2020. Unfortunately, we'll see what 2021 has to bring. But with that, again, I'd like to thank you all for your attendance and participation at the 2021 Communications Academy. I hope you have an enjoyable time and take away a lot of good information that you can apply back to your local served agencies. Again, thank you very much. If you have any questions, my email address is listed on here. Feel free to send me an email. Thank you.